Welcome, everybody. I see we have quite a good turnout tonight, so I'm glad to see so many people interested in CFI and interested in secularism in Canada. Just as a reminder, this event is hosted by Centre for Inquiry Canada. My name is Shauna Watson, and I'm the Vice President and a volunteer with Centre for Inquiry Canada. I'll be doing the introductions, and I'll also be monitoring the Q&A for the after the talk. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with the mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We work to equip people to make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. To that end, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for you to engage with subject matter experts on a variety of topics. In these days of physical distancing, all of CFI events and activities are provided online, and that allows us to make them available from coast to coast. We rely entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events such as this. You can visit our website, centerforinquiry.ca, or email info@centerforinquiry.ca for more information about how to become a member or make a donation. To minimize background noise, we've muted everyone's microphone. After the discussion, we will have an opportunity for people to ask questions. We're going to have questions put by chat, put by text using the chat window, and then I'll be posing the questions. If you don't want your name or image to appear in this recording as this talk is being recorded, please turn off your camera, and you're also welcome to change your screen name. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Leslie Rosenblood. Leslie joined CFI Canada shortly after its inception. In addition to Leslie's role as CFIC's treasurer, he also writes about science, secularism, religion, politics, ethics, and free speech in CFI's publications and on his own blog. Some of you may have seen Leslie's presentation last fall about vaccines, which was called Stab Everyone You Love. And for those of you who missed it or would like to watch it again, you can find it on CFIC's YouTube channel. Leslie firmly believes that evidence-based public policy is the best foundation for laws and regulations, and that facts and their logical implications should form the foundation of discussions in society. Today, Leslie will be talking about secularism in Canada, what it is, what it isn't, and why it's the means to maximal freedom for all. Go ahead, Leslie.
Thank you, Shauna. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see the slides. Hopefully you can all see that. And so, there we go. So I'll be talking today about secularism in Canada. And so I wanted to start with a little bit about myself. So pretty much all of my hours are taken up either working or sleeping or parenting. I'm the proud father of 4 kids, and they're wonderful, which doesn't leave me a lot of extra time. But when I do have it, I focus my activities in 2 main areas. And one is for cultural change. And that's why I have been volunteering for the Centre for Inquiry pretty much since this began. I heard about it a month or 2 after it started up in Canada and joined since then. And its motto is, it supports reason, science, and secular values, which resonated with me instantly because I cannot conceive of a better way to come up with public policy, laws, regulations, and such. And really, if you want to support any kind of argument, these are what this should be the foundation of what you're looking for. And it's an CFIC is an educational charity, and it's looking to really get more people to understand why reason, science, and secular values are the best foundation for pretty much any social activity. But there's more to it than just the grassroots approach. There's also legal and institutional change. And for that, I'm a member, founding member of and a policy advisor for the Canadian Secular Alliance. This is not a charity, but it is a nonprofit. It does research, publishes white papers, policy positions, and advocates for the separation of church and state, and supports strongly the separation, government neutrality in matters of religion. And I'll talk a little bit more about both organizations as I proceed. But as I talk about secularism, I think it's important to give a definition so that we know what it is. So in short, it's the principle of government neutrality in matters of religion. The government should not favor one belief or one religion over other religions, or religious belief in general over those that do not have religious belief. Another way to put it is that the government should neither support nor suppress religious expression amongst its populace. And this is the definition of secularism that I'll be using tonight. It's also the definition of secularism that has been adopted by both the Centre for Inquiry Canada and the Canadian Secular Alliance. But secularism is a word with multiple valid definitions. And so I just want to be clear that what we're talking about tonight when we talk about secularism is not complete church-state separation. That's a valid definition of secularism, but that's not the one that I'll be using today. It also is often referred to as the propensity for non-religious belief or non-religious practices in society. And most commonly when discussed in the media, it's talking about the reduction of religious belief, whether it's church attendance or so on. And so they talk about society becoming increasingly secular, as in non-religious, non-observant, non-practicing. Again, a valid use of the term, but not how I'll be using it tonight. And finally, I often hear secularism used as an epithet, as an insult, to refer to anti-religious bias. That's not a valid use of the term, but it is frequently used that way. And again, that's not how I'm going to be talking about secularism this evening. So let's get into what secularism is in practice. Now, when it really comes down to it, as Canadians, we tend to try and keep politics and religion separate, which I think is a good thing. It's imperfect, but that is the tendency. And in Canada, there's more concern about politicians being too religious over being insufficiently observant. And so if there's going to be a smear campaign against a politician, it's not going to be that they don't attend church or temple or mosque often enough. It's rather that they are a closet creationist, or that they have a hidden agenda to impose their particular religious faith upon others. So laws and regulations, policies are always given, or almost always given, rational justifications, even if they are inspired by faith. And this goes right back to the founding of Medicare in Canada. Tommy Douglas was no doubt inspired by his faith, but the arguments in favor of it when it passed was on the basis of the well-being of Canadians in general. Now, that's not to say that there's no corruption in politics or that there are no bad laws, but we don't tend to have a lot of laws passed with an explicitly religious justification. Now, this is in sharp contrast to the United States, where religion plays an enormous role in politics and elections. Politicians campaign on just how devout, almost exclusively Christian they are. Every public official ends a speech with some variation of "God bless the United States of America." It plays a very prominent role. You can see this in the objections to same-sex marriage before that became legal. They all, at bottom, are based in a religious objection to homosexuality, and particularly the sacrament of marriage being defiled in some way by allowing two people who love each other that are the same sex get married. It's also you can also see that with the false insistence that life begins at conception. So pretty much every objection to abortion in the United States is based in a religious one. There are non-religious philosophical objections to abortion. I I'm familiar with them. I'm not convinced by them, but you will never hear them in public debate in the United States. It is strictly a religious objection. So it plays an enormous role in people's lives and in politics. That said, there has been some progress made. When the first Catholic president was elected, this was Kennedy in 1960, there was a lot of concern over whether his first loyalty would be to the United States or to the Pope. And now with the election of the second Catholic president, Biden, there's lots of people that are happy about that, some people that have some concerns about him, but there's really no mention of his Catholicism being a problem in the sense of divided loyalties. Now, there's also on the books 7 state constitutions that explicitly ban atheists from holding public office, and these are on the books today. I should mention that the terms of these bans are null and void from a 1961 Supreme Court decision, so they cannot take effect. But they are on the books of 7 states, and even though it has been ruled unconstitutional for just about 60 years now, none of them have decided to amend their constitutions to remove that ban. So it is, in practical terms, nearly impossible for an open atheist to get elected in the United States, even if the formal legal barriers have been removed for quite some time. But if you were to look at the United States on paper, if you look at its founding documents, it is in fact very secular. The principles under its constitution are a beacon and are really wonderful. So Article 6 of the Constitution reads, in part, that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. It's clear, it's straightforward, and there's nothing wrong with that. And similarly, its perhaps more famous First Amendment reads in part that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So if you were to look at it without a knowledge of its actual history or how politics is practiced, you would think that the United States is a very secular country with supporting government neutrality in matters of religion. Canada, not so much. We don't really rank all that well if you look at some of our founding documents. So our supreme constitutional document, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, mentions right there in the preface that talks about the supremacy of God, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We have God Keep Our Land, glorious and free, prominently mentioned in the national anthem, and it was only a few years ago that we changed the lyrics of our national anthem, and we decided, or at least the politicians of the day decided to keep God within our national anthem. And we still have constitutionally guaranteed funding of the Catholic school systems in Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Some provinces, such as Quebec and Newfoundland, have used to have separate school boards that funded denominational religious schools, but they've removed it. But they still exist in 3 provinces. So Canada still has a ways to go. Now, how secular was Canada? Basically, not at all. Since its inception, or at its inception and even before, secular principles were completely foreign to this land. So we inherited Christian laws and institutions from England and France. As Canada was being built, both before it officially became a nation and afterwards, only white Christians were considered real Canadians. And this was a toxic blend of racism and religious bigotry that had an enormous impact on the people living here. So one example of that is that the Chinese workers that were working on building our national railway system were considered dispensable and disposable. They were given the most dangerous jobs and injury and death rate among the Chinese workers was many times more than the white workers, and they were paid half the wages of white workers. So the sense of equality was not there at all. And even before we were a country, Canada was a country, we had residential schools, which had the explicit purpose of making the Indigenous peoples of Canada embrace Western values and Christianity. And Western values and Christian values were considered identical. The goal of residential schools, it was quite explicit. We were going to, or the residential schools were going to civilize the savage through Christianization. And this horrific government policy was enthusiastically executed by various Christian churches of Canada. And the last one closed less than 25 years ago in 1996. So well within, I was still in university when that happened. And there were also the Duplessis orphans in Quebec in the 1940s and 50s. So any child born to an unwed mother was forcibly sent to Catholic orphanages days after birth. Then after a few years, Duplessis and the Catholic Church reclassified these orphanages as psychiatric hospitals, primarily because the daily stipend given to an institution that's a psychiatric hospital was basically twice if that same organization was classified as an orphanage. In 2006, the Quebec government offered $26 million in compensation to the survivors of the abuse and neglect that these children suffered. But these survivors had to sign a waiver declaring they would not take legal action against the Catholic Church. Not the Quebec government, but the Catholic Church. So there's a lot that was anything but secular in Canadian history. And then in 1982, we adopted a made in Canada Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the preamble includes the supremacy of God. And I'll just read you the full preamble that says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And this is confusing for myself and well, scholars, because it's ambiguous which is supreme. Supremacy doesn't like to be shared. Only one thing can be supreme. So which is it? Is it God or is it the rule of law? And even the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, had a few things to say about the inclusion of God in the Charter. And I'll give you two quotations. He said, "Strange, so long after the Middle Ages, that some politicians felt obliged to mention God in a constitution which is, after all, a secular and not a spiritual document." He also said, in what I can only imagine was in a fit of pique, "I don't think God gives a damn whether he's in the Constitution or not." So, and then furthermore, the preamble is contradicted by Section 2 of the Charter, which reads that everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion. So if you have the true freedom of conscience, then you are not going to be subject to the supremacy of God. If you have freedom of religion and you don't believe in God, or you believe in a different God, or you don't, or you believe in multiple gods, that freedom is constrained if you also have to acknowledge the supremacy of God. Fortunately, although the preamble to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is symbolically significant, successive Supreme Court rulings give it very little legal weight. So we can proceed as though it was not, as though Canada, it does not recognize the supremacy of God, but it does remain in our charter. And having mentioned the Supreme Court, I want to talk for a few minutes about some significant rulings since the Charter came into effect in 1982 and how jurisprudence has evolved over the last nearly four decades. So the first major case came 3 years after the Charter was adopted. It was called Big M Drug Mart, and it was about Sunday shopping laws. So that stores had to be closed on Sundays by the law, and that law was called the Lord's Day Act. And it was a law that was designed to protect one religion, Christianity. And the defense against that law that the province of Ontario argued at various levels, including the Supreme Court, was that we just wanted a day of rest, and that this is good for everybody. We don't want to overwork everyone. We only have we have a 40-hour work week. We don't need, we don't want to force people to work 7 days a week. But that line of argument was rejected because the law mandated that day of rest had to be on Sunday. So if you happened to be Jewish, for example, and your religious observance said that your day of rest was Saturday and you were to close your shop on Saturday, you couldn't close on Saturday and open on Sunday. So it was clearly not about a day of rest. It was about closing on Sunday. Also, the law itself was called the Lord's Day Act. So it clearly really wasn't about a secular reason for a day of rest. Now, the Supreme Court did leave the door open to having a generic day of rest and to restricting a work week so that people wouldn't be forced to work 7 days a week. But efforts to establish a day of rest in various provinces since that time have either failed or been abandoned. And a good quotation from the ruling is that non-belief is equally protected under religious freedom. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that this sentiment has been established in Canadian jurisprudence. So that's odd. Okay, so then in 2015, there was the Saguenay case. Now, Saguenay is a city in Quebec, and the mayor always started municipal meetings with a prayer, always a Christian prayer, usually a Catholic one. And a resident of the town was an atheist, and he wanted to attend, and he attended these meetings, but he felt very uncomfortable because they started with a prayer, and he felt excluded. And he was told that he could simply just wait outside if he felt uncomfortable while everyone prayed in chambers. So this case went right up to the Supreme Court, and I was part of the Canadian Secular Alliance, which was recognized by the Supreme Court as an intervener in this case. And the Supreme Court ruled that that this was an inappropriate activity, and it barred municipalities from engaging in public prayer. You could be any religion that you wanted. If you wanted to pray in your office, for example, before coming out into chambers, that's totally fine. But using the instrument of government and to start an actual meeting with a prayer was not appropriate and was banned by the Supreme Court. The court ruled that government cannot be seen to be endorsing any particular faith because it would breach its duty of neutrality. And I want to read a couple other quotations from the ruling. And these are all significant because the rulings of the Supreme Court are binding, and they are, and these rulings essentially have the force of law. So it's not just the decision itself, but also its justifications that are significant. So Gascon wrote that sponsorship of one religious tradition by the state in breach of its duty of neutrality amounts to discrimination against all other such traditions. He also wrote, in short, there is a distinction between unbelief and true neutrality. True neutrality presupposes abstention, but it does not amount to a stand favoring one view over another. No such inference can be drawn from the state's silence. And again, for the first time that I'm aware of, he wrote that the preamble to the charter cannot lead to an interpretation of freedom of conscience and religion that authorizes the state to consciously profess a theistic faith. So this was a tremendous victory for secular principles in Canada, and I was delighted to have a very, very small role in this. And then we have Trinity Western University. Now, I could probably talk for at least an hour about this case, and I'll do my best to be brief. Now, Trinity Western University has existed for decades in British Columbia. They are an evangelical Christian institution, and they wanted to open up a law school. All students at the, needed to sign what they called a community covenant. It's a document that runs about 7 pages. So among other things, it forbade sexual intimacy between anybody except married couples, where a marriage is defined as being between one man and one woman. They got approval from the BC Ministry of Education for their curriculum, but then the law societies of British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia said, we find your covenant to be so egregious, we will not recognize your graduates. So you could graduate with a law degree from Trinity Western, but you wouldn't be able to practice in those 3 provinces. And so Trinity Western sued, and they sued in British Columbia, they sued in Ontario, and they sued in Nova Scotia. It went up to the Court of Appeals in each province, and then it went up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And again, the Canadian Secular Alliance was an intervener at the Court of Appeals level in each of the 3 provinces, as well as at the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that discrimination is not a protected religious right, and that freedom of religion includes freedom from religion. So it sided with the law societies. And I'd just like to make another couple quotes from that decision. It says that the Charter does not protect measures by which an individual or faith community seeks to impose adherence to their religious beliefs or practices on others who do not share their underlying faith. Now, this decision was 7-2. So there were 2 justices at the Supreme Court that ruled in favor of Trinity Western. But even them, even the 2 justices that ruled in favor of Trinity Western wrote the following: secularism connotes pluralism and respect for diversity, and that elsewhere, it guarantees an inclusive public sphere by neither privileging nor silencing any single view. They wrote that the secular state is a neutral state, and they reiterate that state neutrality must prevail. So even justices that disagreed with the majority, they sided with Trinity Western, they still profess very strong secular values in the sense of state neutrality in matters of religion. And there was a difference between them and the majority in terms of how that principle should be applied. So quick quiz for you. Canada had a blasphemy law, and now it doesn't. Do you know when it was repealed? I will think about that. I'm going to answer that in just a couple of minutes. But change comes through multiple venues. It doesn't always come through the Supreme Court. Section 296 of the Criminal Code read that everyone who publishes a blasphemous libel is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. Now, the last conviction under this law was in 1927, and the last time it was invoked was in 1979 in an attempt to censor this film, Monty Python's Life of Brian. So given that it's been over 30 years now since it was even invoked, and close to a century since it was used in the conviction, the law is clearly effectively defunct. So why am I celebrating its repeal as a milestone to be celebrated? There's a couple of reasons for that. One are moral reasons. And some of the moral reasons are that immigrants that come to this country are often fleeing religious persecution, and they feel uncomfortable being aware of the laws of Canada that that we do have a blasphemy law, and if they happen to come from a religious tradition that is a minority view in Canada, then they feared being prosecuted and convicted and going to jail over that. So it really restricted their sense of safety and security and freedom in Canada. And also other countries used Canada as a moral shield for their blasphemy laws. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have the death penalty for blasphemy. And when Canada objected to this, they simply pointed to our laws and said, well, you're willing to put people in jail for 2 years. We also agree that it is a criminal offense. We happen to think it's a capital offense, but clearly you're okay with the principle. So they were using, so other countries would be using our laws as a shield for their own. And even though, and then finally under the moral category, even though it hasn't been used, our blasphemy laws hadn't been used in quite some time, that could change. And government could prosecute under that law at any time until such time as it was repealed. Just because they hadn't in decades doesn't mean they couldn't. And there's a practical reason as well, which it's the one that led to its ultimate repeal, and that is having laws on the books, even if the ones you're not going to use is not a good thing. So when a man in Alberta was convicted of murder, the judge cited a section of the criminal code that the Supreme Court had previously declared to be unconstitutional. So the law itself was null and void. It's called a zombie law. And that gave immediate grounds for appeal to this man who was convicted of murder. So that was quite embarrassing to the government of the day. So in response to that, the federal justice minister announced a review of the criminal code. As part of that, the Canadian Secular Alliance, the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and Humanist Canada met with the senior bureaucrat of the Justice Department in charge of that file, and we brought Canada's blasphemy law to his attention. And we argued that while it had not been tested by the courts, if it ever was brought before the courts, it would almost certainly be found to be unconstitutional. A couple of months after that meeting, a bill was introduced that removed all of the zombie laws from the criminal code. So those are the laws that the Supreme Court had already ruled to be unconstitutional. We were a little bit disappointed by that. But fortunately, a few months later, a second bill was introduced that promised to repeal Canada's blasphemy law. And this was an omnibus bill. It removed, among other things, the blasphemy law, the law that made it illegal to challenge someone to a duel, to fraudulently pretend to practice witchcraft, and to impersonate somebody during a university exam. So to answer the question at the bottom of the slide, Canada repealed its blasphemy law on December 13th, 2018, so just over 2 years ago. So there's a few other examples of secular debates that are happening within Canadian society. I'll give some examples of the last couple of years. Medical assistance in dying. When this law was introduced, the debate in society was largely about whether people could have any say about how much they suffer before they die. Whether people should be able to choose the time of and means of their death, or whether we should accept the religious view that we should not be playing God by murdering people before the end of their natural life. So we did pass MAID, medical assistance in dying, and today the debate continues, but the way it's framed has changed significantly. By and large, right now, the terms of the debate are discussions about what the appropriate conditions are. Under what circumstances should we allow people to get medical assistance in dying? and whether we should expand the categories or not, and what the proper procedure should be and the timing when someone decides to end their life. So that's a really significant change in the tone and tenor of the debate in a fairly short period of time. Another one was something from just last year in the summer. There was an order for the RCMP officers to wear N95 respirator masks, and anyone who chose not to do so or could not do so would be given to desk duty, assigned to desk duty. And a number of Muslim and Sikh RCMP officers took great exception to this because a number of them have large bushy beards, and you can't get a good seal on an N95 respirator mask with a large beard. Now, initially, the government said, well, this is a public health emergency, and so we've got this rule in place, and we stand behind it. And from a secular perspective, at first blush, this seems to be an entirely reasonable stance. But then if you get into it a little bit deeper, the policy of requiring masks is completely reasonable. The problem was the requirement for N95 respirator masks. There was no evidence at the time that for the types of interactions that an RCMP officer would have with the public, that they needed an N95, that they needed a respirator mask. That type of mask is really required for very close contact, like when a doctor is intubating a patient. And there was no evidence that it was required for an RCMP officer. So the rule was amended so that mask wearing was mandatory, but not a respirator mask, and that it was both consistent with the evidence and addressed the concerns of the Sikh and Muslim officers who were disproportionately affected by this rule. And then finally, what is probably the most contentious debate happening within secular circles in Canada is Quebec's Bill 21, which is also known as its secularism law. And among other things, it bans the wearing of religious symbols by certain civil servants, not all of them, but by a certain class of them. So both the Centre for Inquiry Canada and the Canadian Secular Alliance view this law as a unjustifiable repression of religious expression, and we are against the bill. I am personally, as are these two organizations. However, not all secular organizations feel that way. The Mouvement Laïque of Quebec, at the MLQ, which was our partner and one of the primary litigants in the Saguenay case that I referred to earlier, is staunchly in favor of this bill. And so the secular community has really come down on both sides of this controversy, and it's something that I think comes down to what is largely an Anglo version of secularism, which is the one that I subscribe to, which is government neutrality in matters of religion, and the more francophone version of secularism, which tends to look at church-state separation as the key definition. Now, in most circumstances, you're going to come to the same conclusion, even with these different premises, but in this case, it hasn't. So there were two challenges launched to this bill in the courts pretty much immediately. One was the fundamental constitutionality of the law, and the second one was for an emergency stay, so that while the actual challenge to determine whether it was constitutional or not was working its way through the courts, it's a long process. An emergency stay was requesting that the terms of this law not come into effect until it's determined whether it is in fact legal. So the Quebec Court of Appeal ruled 2-1 against granting an emergency stay in December 2019. So the terms of the law came into effect at that time. Now, the majority wrote in that decision, in part, and this is translated from the ruling in French. The notwithstanding clause dictates that at this stage of the case, the courts must abandon to their fate women graduates who are willing to work and who, for the sole reason that they wear the veil, in this case referring to the hijab, for the sole reason that they wear the veil, have been denied access to a job for which they hold all the skills. The Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal on the emergency stay, so that law remains in effect until future rulings. Now, late last year in November, the Quebec Superior Court heard the challenge to the law's constitutional validity. There was lots of testimony over the course of a couple of weeks. The ruling for that case has not yet been released, but however the Quebec Superior Court rules, I'm sure that it is going to go to the Quebec Court of Appeal and to the Supreme Court of Canada. And when it does, the Secular Alliance will request to be an intervener in that case. But to go back to Canada, a lot has changed in the past few decades and for the better. In 1939, more than 900 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany were denied entry into Cuba, the US, and then Canada, which forced the ocean liner to return to Europe. Canada's policy at the time when it came to Jewish refugees was effectively none is too many. And in the 12 years of the Holocaust, from 1933 to 1935, Canada admitted approximately 5,000 Jewish refugees, which is the worst record in the world out of any country that accepted refugees at all. So that was Canada in 1939. And then Canada in 2017, this became a very famous tweet. The Prime Minister of Canada said that to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you. And over the course of 4 years, nearly 60,000 Syrian refugees were accepted by Canada. So things have changed and for the better. That said, there is more work to be done. So if Orwell were alive today, he'd get government subsidies if he started a religion. So here's a lot of the ways in which a government directly supports religious expression instead of being neutral. We have a Catholic school system in 3 provinces, and here in Ontario, it is fully funded through to the end of secondary school. The advancement of religion is a charitable purpose. So Center for Inquiry Canada is a registered charity. We are an educational charity. You can get charitable status in Canada simply for advancing religion. So you can be religious and run a soup kitchen. You can be a religious organization and educate and do other things that are deemed to be charitable. But if all you do is evangelize, if advancement of religion is your sole activity, that is assumed to be charitable under the law in Canada at the moment. And there's billions of dollars that get transferred to religious organizations through this policy. There's the housing tax deduction for clergy, which is available to those that are that work for religious institutions that are not available to others. And a place of worship and lands used in connection with them are exempt from property taxes. Now, the Center for Inquiry Canada published a report a couple of years ago about the cost of religion in Canada that started looking at this. We're going to be publishing over the course of the next several months a follow-up series of reports that are going to be analyzing the cost of religion in Canada. So to just give you a couple of highlights, we have found that religion is subsidized by over $5 billion annually based on 2018 data, $3 billion in tax credits for charitable tax receipts, $1 billion of direct subsidies and transfers, over $500 million for income tax and GST and HST credits, over nearly just under $1 billion from the property tax exemption. So stay tuned and check the CFIC website in the months to come, and all of the details of these figures will and our analysis will become available. And of course, we still have, as I mentioned earlier, God in the Charter and in the national anthem. So there are two pillars of secularism, and they need to move in sync with each other. There's the legal and institutional, as well as the cultural. And one can leapfrog the other. They don't have to be perfectly in sync, but one can't go too much ahead of the other, because if they get too far apart, then the tendency, at least historically in various places, is to snap back. And I think that a good example of that is the history of equal marriage here in Canada. So I think that a truly secular view of neutrality will recognize that freedom of religion is important, and it's not just freedom from religion. So decades of activism from the gay community led to a lessening of the societal taboo on homosexual relationships. The first same-sex marriage in Canada took place in a church, and that took advantage of religious freedom. It was kind of a loophole. Marriages could come into effect by a procedure known as the reading of the banns, and this was done to marry two men. And once that happened, this led to 8 provincial court decisions in Canada, starting in Ontario in 2003, that recognized legally that same-sex marriages were valid. And then federal law did so in 2005. Now, when that came into effect nationally in 2005, Canadians were roughly split evenly on whether Canada should allow same-sex marriages. A decade and a half later, in 2020, a similar survey recorded that nearly 3/4 of Canadians support same-sex marriage. So that's real progress. And so, in my opinion, secularism should be boring. When it works properly, secularism should be pretty much invisible, like other social and physical infrastructure. Most people don't think very much about where the water from the tap comes from, or how electricity is generated and transported to your house. You just want to be able to take a shower or get a glass of water from the sink, and you just want the light to turn on when you flip the switch. And in my view, government neutrality in matters of religion is something that everyone should selfishly support, not just atheists, not just religious minorities, but everybody. And the reason for that is that secularism is the compromise position that ensures maximum freedom for everyone. If it's applied consistently, secularism, this principle will prevent discrimination against members of a particular faith, favoritism towards members of a specific sect to the detriment of others, and treating non-believers differently than believers. And even if you happen to benefit from state favoritism today, there's no guarantee that your denomination is going to remain in power in a pluralistic society like Canada. And so all of the tools that are used to favor who you are today could be used against you down the road. Better to take those tools away from government. It's establish the principle of neutrality, and everyone can benefit can benefit from that. And that is why I am a staunch secularist. So that brings us to the end of my formal presentation. I want to thank you for staying with me for all this time. Some people can consider this to be a fairly dry topic. I consider it fascinating. It is animated by activism for the last pretty much decade and a half. So thank you for staying with me. If you want more information, you can go to the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and the URL is there, as well as the Twitter handle. There's also the Canadian Secular Alliance, and that's you can go to the website or follow them on Twitter. As Shauna mentioned at the beginning, I do have a blog. I write about these and other topics. And I am also occasionally on Twitter. I post roughly weekly, so if you do follow me, you certainly won't be bombarded with tweets. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to write them into the Q&A text box or into the chat box, and Shauna will be able to ask them of me. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Leslie for a very informative presentation. And now we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So we'll be using the chat window to accept questions by text. We'll ask you to type in your question and I'll present it to Leslie. As I mentioned, the session's being recorded, so please indicate if you want your name to be included when your question is posed. So do we have any questions? Okay. So here's a question. Why do you think that there's the paradox that the US is more secularly legal, but so much more full of God as opposed to Canada?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm not sure what the mechanism would be. I mean, that delves into areas of expertise that I don't have in terms of history and social science. I observe that that is the case, but I don't really know why. Of of developed countries, of advanced societies and democracies, the United States is really an outlier. Pretty much throughout Europe and in other places like Japan over the years, religious observance and the prominence of religion within society has gradually declined. And that's true to a lesser extent in the United States as well, but not in its politics. And why that is, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it's just a matter of something that's unlikely, doesn't happen all that often, does still happen, and it happened to be in the United States, so it's very prominent. But if there are, I'm sure that someone must have done research on this, because it's a fascinating topic and something that impacts well, Americans and Canadians quite strongly, and the world at large. And so I'd really welcome a well-informed answer on that, someone that's done the research. All I could really do is offer a guess and a supposition, and I don't want to stray too much from my area of expertise. So I'm sorry that I'm not able to give a comprehensive answer to that, except I'll just acknowledge that it's an excellent question that warrants more research.
Thanks, Leslie. Here's a question from somebody who works in the food animal industry. We Canadians like the dollar, so all types of religious slaughter is promoted by politicians against secular principles. What's your view on that?
Sorry, we like the dollar. Sorry, could you read that again? I'm not sure I heard it.
So the idea is we accept and regulate a whole bunch of different kinds of religious-based slaughter, and it's against secular principles. And I'll add, as others have pointed out, that it is also in some cases a less humane method, some of the methods that are religiously based. So what's your view on that?
So I'm not against the killing of animals in a religious manner in principle, just on its face. I think that there needs to, I don't think that it should be banned to kill an animal in a halal or a kosher manner simply because it's religious. What I do think is that there needs to be standards of cleanliness. There need to be standards of for health reasons, and we are having a societal debate about the standards for the humane slaughter of animals. And I think that those that are slaughtering animals in a religious manner need to adhere to these common standards. And so far, that's what's happened. I know that there are some countries in Europe that have banned certain that you could create standards that would require a modification of the traditional ways of killing animals, and if we do that, then that's fine and acceptable. And but the purpose should not be to ban religious slaughter of animals or to ban rituals. It needs to be based on community standards of health and cleanliness and care for the animals themselves, kind of independent of the impact it would have on the standards or the traditional slaughter of animals. So it is possible to word a law, for example, that does not seem to target a particular community, but that nonetheless does. So I remember that there's the old expression that the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor from sleeping under bridges and begging in the streets. Clearly, that's not a law that affects the rich the way it does the poor. So we have to be careful when crafting these standards that our motivation is not to suppress a religious community and the way they do things, but neither should that be an exemption that they get simply because it is a tradition that they have been following for some number of centuries or millennia.
Thank you, Leslie. A question, can you talk about the difference between secularism at a personal private level as opposed to the society level?
Well, I've been talking about secularism on the societal level. I mean, I tried to make this not about my own personal beliefs, but the way that principle should be applied more generally. I think that when you start talking about secularism at the personal level versus the societal level, that's where you get into different definitions of secularism. So if you talk about secularism at the personal level, usually that's associated with church attendance and personal belief in an afterlife or in a religious tradition or its lack. If you really want to talk about neutrality in matters of religion, then on a personal level, then like you can be my friend or my associate regardless of whatever religious beliefs you hold. I'm going to judge your worth as a person based on your behaviors and your morals and what you do. Are you a good person as I define good? And certain religious tenets are certainly compatible with how I define the good, and certain religious tenets are not compatible with how I define the good. So, or what is good. So on a personal level, don't discriminate on the basis of religion in terms of whatever power you have and in terms of your personal, excuse me, in terms of your personal interactions. But I do think that, as I've defined it for the purposes of this evening, government neutrality in matters of religion, that's not really a lot about your personal life, but I certainly try and live my life according to reason, science, and secular values. And those are the morals and ethics that are derived from what we know about the world and compassion for our fellow human being. And I try and apply that in my day-to-day life.
Thanks, Leslie. A question about a comment you made about the pro-life anti-abortion movement. And so the question is, why do you think, why is it your opinion that the anti-abortion movement in the United States is largely religious? And because as Christine points out, many of the pro-life Christians she knows appeal to secular arguments to make their case, along with their arguments, including God.
So the reason I say that is because, as I acknowledged in the main part of the talk, while secular arguments against abortion do exist, I have never once heard a politician arguing against abortion employ them. It is always a religious justification, or sometimes there's a little bit of obfuscation where they might not explicitly mention God, but it's still at bottom. You just scratch under the surface of the arguments, and it comes out to a religious objection, to abortion. I think that that's unfortunate. I would much rather that the debate on abortion was more fact-based, but that simply hasn't been the case. And if there ever is a politician that argues against abortion on using secular arguments, I have yet to encounter them, despite their existence and availability.
Thanks, Leslie. A question about what specific actions can CFIC or Secular Alliance undertake to address the public funding of Catholic schools in various provinces in Canada?
So that's an excellent question, and there's a number of different possible approaches. So one is something like that is education. Actually, is to make people aware that of just how egregiously discriminatory it is, to bring to people's attention that the United Nations has condemned Canada and Ontario specifically on multiple occasions for its discriminatory education system, where one particular faith gets subsidized to the tune of billions of dollars a year in a way that no other religious denomination gets the benefit from. I think that if we are able to change people's minds at a grassroots level, then that will take the form that will have a cumulative effect of rising up and changing politicians' minds. I think that the cause of defunding or eliminating the separate school system in Ontario was dealt a tremendous blow about a dozen years ago, when the current mayor of Toronto, John Tory, was leader of the provincial Progressive Conservative Party, and in an election, in the early days of an election campaign, he promised to fund all denominational schools where numbers warrant, and nobody wanted that. And he was trounced in the election. And so now politicians drew, I think, the wrong lesson from that. It showed that Ontarians don't want government funding of religious schools, but the lesson they drew is just don't touch the education system in Ontario. So that was unfortunate. A couple other areas that CFIC and the CSA can engage in is the lobbying of politicians and meeting with them and explaining the case when the Ontario is in debt and running deficits. Several studies have shown that that it could save up to $1 billion a year or more every year to have a single publicly funded school system in the province of Ontario, and then that the numbers would be slightly different for the other provinces in Saskatchewan and Alberta, but still significant. And then finally, there's the potential of lawsuits to test the constitutionality of continuing to fund schools in this manner. And there's a number of potential approaches that could be a number of areas that could be attacked in this way. So those are a few ways that CFIC and CSA can be and have been active.
Thanks, Leslie. There's another question along that line about If you have ideas of what CFIC and CSA can do to address the Catholic healthcare system in Alberta called Covenant Health. Apparently there's millions of dollars of taxpayer money being dumped into this religious healthcare system, and there are many doctors and healthcare providers in that system refusing to provide full palliative care, and also various forms of birth control, etc.
Yeah, that is an issue, and that stems from our history. We inherited a lot of institutions that were Christian in nature. There's a number of Catholic hospitals throughout the country, in Ontario and Alberta, that are funded, and uh, as we proceed and as we progress and we offer services like abortion and medical assistance in dying, this has been uh, uh, fought quite tenaciously by these religious institutions. And we saw that as well with, for example, when equal marriage became the law of the land, there was a big push and some lawsuits that wanted that to force justices of the peace. They were claiming their religious freedom to deny two people that were otherwise legally entitled to get married, two men or two women. The justice of the peace wanted to have the right to say, no, it violates my religious sensitivities, my religious belief, to allow the two of you to get married. And we hear about that in the States perhaps more often, but that was the case here in Canada. So I think that what we need is leadership at the provincial level to say, you are a publicly funded institution. You are receiving government dollars to provide medical services to the populace of the province, and you need to offer the full suite of medical services. It's the patient first, and patient needs trump the religious objection. So it is perfectly fine, in my view, for a Catholic. It is perfectly fine for a Catholic to practice medicine, but it is not okay to practice Catholic medicine. You practice evidence-based medicine, and if your patient wants birth control, for example, it is your obligation as a medical professional to provide it, or to provide the means for your patient to obtain it.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that's all the questions that we have.
Okay.
So I just have a few closing remarks. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I'd like to draw everybody's attention to some of our upcoming events. On February 28th, just about a month from now, philosopher Greg Caruso will speak about free will, punishment, and criminal justice. We also have a number of other talks coming up in March and April, and also an online conference planned for May. So you can find out about all of our upcoming events in Meetup, Facebook, or on the CFIC website. As I mentioned at the beginning, CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. We hope that those of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to the membership page in the chat window, and you can also get it through Meetup. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policy, healthcare, public education, and human rights. So please consider joining us as a member or a donor. Finally, I'd like to thank all the CFIC volunteers who help with this and also with other events. If you'd like to volunteer with CFIC, you can sign up on our website. We have many interesting positions for people to choose from. Once again, I would like to thank Leslie for being our speaker tonight. And since Zoom does not do well with audible clapping, I invite everyone to express their appreciation by using the clap icon that you can find by tapping or clicking on the Participants tab and then select More. and then you can put a clap out to the ether.
Thank you all. It's great to see dozens of you out tonight on a very cold evening. In addition to being the secular chair of CFIC, I'm also the treasurer, and I can assure you that this is an organization that punches well above its weight. And so anything that you can donate to either the Secular Alliance or to the Center for Inquiry Canada, it goes a long way. So please consider becoming a member of either or both organizations. I am, and as you've heard this evening, we've made a big difference, and we hope to continue to do so. But it doesn't happen magically. It happens as a result of the hard efforts of its members and volunteers, and from the donations through memberships and monthly contributions from people like you. We're not, Shauna and myself, we're not superhuman. We're just folks that think this is really important, and we work really hard to make a difference, and we have. So thank you for your support, and if you are able, please consider, if you're not already, please consider becoming members and making a one-time a month donation.
Thanks again, Leslie, and thanks to everybody for coming, and hope everybody has a good night. Stay warm, stay healthy, and bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.